Whistle while you work.
From Disney on March 21st, the magical tale
Snow White.
Snow White?
Snow White.
that started it all
I believe you're looking for me.
arrives in theaters.
Magic mirror on the wall.
Experience the Disney classic
Who's the fairest one of all?
like never before.
We haven't even been introduced yet.
Disney Snow White, only in theaters March 21st. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested.
At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Hey, where you been? Buckeye Talk is about to begin. Hey, come on in.
Welcome back to Buckeye Talk. I'm Stephen Means. That's Stefan Krajisnik, and that's Andrew Gillis. And spring practice is almost here. March 17th starts spring practice. Get the text 614-350-3315. All news, all analysis, all everything you could possibly need in your Buckeye fandom coming straight to your phone. You don't even have to go look for it. We'll come to you. Buckeye Talk. We're starting our previews. We actually started them on Monday with Stefan and I, just asking some general questions about things that we want to learn this spring, but we didn't really go too deep. And the reason why we didn't go too deep is because we're going to spend the next 2 weeks doing in-depth breakdowns of each position group. And that starts this week with the defensive side of the ball, starting up front in the trenches, where, Andrew, they have lost 217 tackles, 400 tackles for loss, 27 and a half sacks, and 154 pressures from the 2024 college football team, which won a national championship. Oh, yeah. Plus, they lost Hero Canoe to Texas. Should people panic?
No. Panic, no. Worry, yes. And I think that those are two different things. I think panic would be if it was unexpected. I mean, this was the deal that you made, right? Like, this was what you knew was going to happen one day. You knew that JT and Jack were no longer going to be with the program after this season. You knew that when Tyleik Williams decided to come back, you were going to have to replace him. You knew that, okay, we have Ty Hamilton coming in, but it's a 1-year thing for him as a starter. Like, you knew all of this, right? So that's why I think panic might be maybe too strong of a word, because I think when you talk about panic, it kind of elicits this reaction of like, oh no, this is crazy. What's happening? We don't know what's going on. Where it's, you kind of were able to plan for this. You kind of were able to prepare for this, right? It's a little bit like a hurricane. Like it's not an earthquake. It's a hurricane. You saw the hurricane coming for a few days. You were able to get out of there and make preparations for what's next. Now you need to figure out what's next. And so I think the worry for me, if I was an Ohio State fan, and the worry I think for Ohio State fans should be, they just won a national championship because their defensive line was so dominant, or in part because their defensive line was so dominant. I mean, everybody's going to talk about Jack and JT going nuts in the playoff and, how stout they were against the run, especially against like Notre Dame, where, Notre Dame just could not run the ball on them. The teams just were not able to move the football that way. And now you're in a position where you're going to start some guys where, yeah, the potential is there, but there's no guarantee that it's going to be what it was. And frankly, it's probably not going to be what it was. You probably have, a first-round pick in Tyleik and 2 second-round picks in your defensive ends, and then, a mid to late-round pick in Ty Hamilton. Like, that's a really difficult thing to replace. So I think fans should be a little worried, a little concerned about where this defensive line is going to be. Doesn't mean it's going to be a bad defensive line. It just means that you just had a really, really great defensive front, and now they're all going to the NFL. And this was kind of the plan all along. This was kind of what was going to happen all along.
So here's how we're going to do these pods. We have the who, we have the what, and we have conclusions. That's it. There's not a where, when, and how because, the where is the Woody Hayes Athletic Center for the next 15 practices. The when is the starting March 17th. And the how, we can't answer that question until March 17th once we see people actually doing football things. So for now, it's the who and the what is what we're focusing on, starting with the who. Stefan, here's what I have. And somebody chime in if I may be off about this. Defensive ends, Kenyatta Jackson, Caden Curry, Joshua Mickens, Dominic Kirks. Defensive tackle, Edric Houston, Caden McDonald, Jason Moore, Tywan Malone, Will Smith, Eric Mensah. And that's it. In terms of who's next, who's back from last year. They're not returning starters, but they're up next. These are the guys fighting for roles in that situation. That's 4 defensive ends and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 defensive tackles. This is not a fair question, but I'm going to ask you to do it anyway. Evaluate what you think you're expecting to see on March 17th, really for the next 15 practices when things start in 2 weeks, based on those names, those numbers, and what they have for coming back.
I think for me, Steven, when you and I talked about spring practice, we talked about, how much reps, how much playing time are we going to really see from guys like Jeremiah Smith, like Caleb Downs. Defensive line, even for veteran guys like Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson, I think we probably see a good amount of them, right? Like they need to grow up pretty fast here in terms of what they're doing specifically on the defensive line. I think we all know, Caden Curry's an experienced guy who's probably got a decent voice on his team. And, we saw the stuff that he did on special teams, especially this year, and the stuff he did on defense. But he's still got to take that next step, right? Kenyatta Jackson, we saw what he can do, but he's got to take that next step. So I wonder, and I maybe even will predict, that we probably see the ones for the defensive line get a decent amount of reps, relative to maybe some of the other starters across this roster.
Andrew, does the same apply at defensive tackle? Those 6 guys in there, you're just expecting to see a lot of those guys because they need the reps.
Yeah, I think you want to get Houston and McDonald, the likely 1-2 tandem at defensive tackle. I think you want to get those a lot of reps, get those guys a lot of reps. But I also think you're probably setting up a rotation there with Tywan Malone, Jason Moore, Will Smith Jr., Eric Mensah. Like, I think that, to me, it feels like you have more depth at defensive tackle than you do defensive end. Because I'll put it like this, I think Jason Moore is going to be a really, really good defensive tackle. And I think he's a really, really good 3rd defensive tackle on this year's team, on the 2025 team. I'm not sure you got a Jason Moore of the defensive ends, which is hilarious because he started as a defensive end at Ohio State. I'm not sure you got a player with that upside in that mix. I'm not sure you got a player that, kind of qualifies in that category behind Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson at defensive end. So I think at defensive end, I think you probably want to maybe get those starters some reps, but at defensive tackle, you probably feel a little bit more comfortable rotating.
Okay, then you got 5 early. Well, you got 5 recruits. I don't know if all these guys are here right now, but in terms of the 5 new guys, Zion Grady, number 81 player, number 9 edge rusher. Jacquez Carter, number 197 player, number 18 defensive lineman. Epi Satonali, the number 252 player, number 27 edge rusher. Maxwell Roy, number 355 player, number 36 defensive lineman. And then Trajan Odom, the number 519 player, number 61 defensive lineman. First and foremost, Andrew, how many of those guys are actually here right now? Because if they're not here, they don't matter for this discussion right now, with all respect to those guys.
Yeah, I believe all of them are.
Okay.
And for example, they're all here. Zion Grady, I think, is probably the only one that people should really kind of take note of for year one. I think that kid is somebody that you look at and go, oh, wow, okay, this kid might be able to play as a freshman. I'm not saying it's going to be, in a starting capacity, but I do think of the freshmen that we're going to talk about, I think Grady is probably the one where you would say, okay, let's have a conversation about him.
Is that at inside or is that at defensive end?
That's at defensive end.
Okay. And then we've got Logan George, Stefan, the Utah State to Idaho State to Ohio State pipeline is strong with this one.
Never been stronger.
What's he bring?
Yeah, I'm really interested with him as a prospect, right? He's someone who had a ton of tackles for loss last year in the FCS level. Steven, we saw him, where was that? Was that in Atlanta?
Yeah.
Where we were both like, he's kind of small. Like he's not very big, like a Jack Sawyer JT type. So I'm very interested to see what Ohio State thinks they have there, because when you look at the numbers and what he was able to do at Idaho State, it seems like he's pretty good, especially in the run game and slowing down the run. But at that size, I'm really intrigued to see what that translates to in the Big Ten and what Larry Johnson thinks he has there. He's maybe one of the more. I'd probably put him and Zion Grady in the category of two really intriguing prospects where I'm curious what you see out of them in their first year at Ohio State and how much we see them kind of grow as the year goes on.
For the record, 3 of the 5 defensive linemen from the 2025 class are here. Epi Satanale and Max Roy did not early enroll. Last question for you, Stefan. Is Hero Knuth transferring to Texas, which, again, as a reminder, college football is a business? Is that going to end up being a bigger deal, not that big of a deal, or are people reacting to that loss the right amount, given how we're talking about? It seems like we know who the top 2 are. Number 3 and 4 right now, at least if you have your name tags, really, right? You're ready to write someone's name on it, but it's not like anyone's claimed it yet.
Yeah, I agree. Hero would be kind of in this category with a lot of the guys that we talk. Like, I'd put him maybe just slightly below, but pretty close to like Caden McDonald and Kenyatta Jackson, just because we know the potential, we know the name, we know they've been in the program and been developing behind the scenes, even if they haven't been playing a ton. You lose part of that, right? So like, I'm not going to come on here and be like, Hero Knuth was going to be, 100% stout and one of the best defensive tackles in the Big Ten, but he's a guy that at least we would know, and a guy that at least we could say he's spent a few years with Larry Johnson. He's developed in this program. You kind of know what you're getting from guys when they are developing in this program. You don't have that luxury, right? Like, I mean, would it ever surprise you if we got to August and he was competing for a starting job? It wouldn't be totally shocking, right? Like, it'd be pretty surprising, but it wouldn't be shocking. And you lose that. So not only do you lose a piece of depth, but you lose a guy who's been around the program and knows the program, knows this defensive line.
Well, the good news is his next game will be the Ohio State-Texas game in Ohio Stadium. The bad news is he will not be in the home locker room when that game is played. That's so interesting. Texas and Ohio State really just played each other. Now they got to play each other again. It's so fun. I love when that's stuff
Steve
like
Sarkisian
that
has basically spent when we get to August, it's going to be like, I've spent 9 months watching Ohio State.
Yep. It's just, I haven't prepared for another team. It's just been Ohio State. That's awesome. Okay. That's the who. That's all the names of all the people Larry Johnson expected to be back as a defensive line coach, along with he's got some new GAs in that room. He's got some new QCs in that room as well, because guys like Lyle and Clark have gone on and gotten, ironically enough, he's at Texas now. That's their defensive. I think he's their edge rushers, outside linebackers coach.
Yeah, outside linebackers, I think is the title.
Everybody splits up their responsibilities different. In Texas is they're like outside linebackers, nickels, outside corners, middle linebacker. It's just, I don't know. You do whatever you want with your 10 assistants. Okay, that's the who. We're going to take a break, and then we're going to get to the what, which is us essentially assigning goals, buying stock in players, and everything else you can think of when we come back from the break here on Buckeye Talk.
You've maxed out your 401k. You're contributing to an IRA and making some other investments. You're ahead of the game and doing well. But where do you go from here? The same old story can only get you so far. If you want a new take from a new type of financial professional, we invite you to get a fresh perspective beside an agent with the backing of New York Life. Insurance, investments, retirement, and more. Visit NYL.com to learn more. Investments are offered through registered representatives of NYLife Securities, LLC. Member FINRA SIPC, a New York Life company.
It's winter, and you can now get almost anything you need for the coldest months of the year delivered with Uber Eats. What do we mean by almost? Well, you can't get a ski slope delivered, but you can get dish soap delivered. Sunshine, that's a no. But a bottle of wine? That's a yes. A snow angel? Sorry, no. But angel hair pasta? Uber Eats can definitely get you that. Get almost anything delivered with Uber Eats. Order now. Alcohol and select markets. Product availability may vary by region. See app for details.
We're back here on Buckeye Talk. Stephen Means, Stefan Krajisnik, and Andrew Gillis. We're previewing Ohio State's spring for 2025, and we're starting up front with the defensive line. We ran through all the names expected to be here in the spring. They're going to have all but two of the people who are eventually going to be in the room in 2025, and that's two true freshmen who won't get here until May or June. So now it's time for the what. And I told Stefan and Andrew to provide what they think their number one goal is for this group in the spring. Just in the spring. So the goal can't be, have 50 sacks. Well, you can't do that in the spring. Well, you can, but, not tangibly, right? So it's got to be something they can accomplish this spring. It can be everything under the block. I also had them come with a list of things just in case somebody steals their first thing. Stefan, you are up first. What is your number one goal for the defensive line over the next 15 practices?
You know what's interesting is when we first started looking at the defensive line, and we just talked about it with Hero Canoe, I think my original question was going to circle around the interior, and then I started looking at the depth chart a bit more, and I actually think it's the edge where I'm curious. I'm going to throw CJ Hicks into this conversation. I'm going to cheat a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I want to know what they're doing at end, defensive end, edge rusher, whatever you want to call it, beyond Kenyatta Jackson and Caden Curry. Because I just don't know what it looks like right now. We talked about Logan George, the FCS transfer. We talked about Zion Grady, the freshman. Would you say they're the top two options right now to kind of be that third edge rusher?
Yes. Unless Joshua Mickens or Dominic Kirks take a step.
Right.
Especially more Mickens than Kirks, because Mickens is in year 3 now. But I would say, yes, that of people we know for sure are defensive ends, the transfer in the top 100 recruit from Alabama. Yes.
So how's that make you feel? Because the third option...
Therapist Stefan, I like it.
The third option in 2024 was, you could say Kenyatta, Kate, like the guys that are starters now, they were the third option. And that was it was third and fourth option. Those were good options. Those were guys we pointed at and said, if it wasn't for these guys coming back, they'd be starting.
Yeah.
So now they are starting. And it kind of, I guess, there have been questions, unless I'm mistaken here, there have been some questions about recruiting at end these last few years, right?
Correct. Yes.
And this is maybe where we got to last year with Justin Fry, where we were like, what do you have at tackle if one of these guys go down? Well, the thing with offensive tackle is at least you could say, well, if these guys are healthy, they're going to play most of the reps. I mean, Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson are going to play most of the reps, but they're not going to play all the reps. So what's it look like? And can these guys make a jump? And where's CJ Hicks entered this conversation?
So here's where I think it's different than offensive line. Because there's not a scheme on the planet that doesn't include 5 offensive line. I actually don't even think I think it might be against the rule. You have 5 people with their hand in the dirt. So that's the primary difference here. And so there's 2 ways to look at it. You can do what you just did, which I think is a fair point. Larry Johnson's defensive end recruiting hasn't been great since 21 and then 20, backing that up with 22. The 2023 class wasn't great. 2024 class, you got Edric Houston, but he moved into defensive tackle. And that seemed like that was always going to happen. And then this past year, it's why I looked at Epi Satanale, and he's not here, so I want to limit how much I'm talking about him. But 6'5", 220, even if he was here, there's going to be some physical transformation. They're going to put some weight on him, I think. But I'm glad you brought up CJ Hicks. So let's make this decision right now as we're doing a defensive line podcast. We're going to do linebackers tomorrow. Are we choosing to make CJ Hicks an end on Buckeye Talk? Are we going to mark that down?
I think if Buckeye Talk has expectations of CJ Hicks playing this year, then we should.
Okay. So Stefan is saying yes. Andrew, are you saying yes? CJ Hicks, according to Buckeye Talk, we are predicting that when March 17th rolls around and we are in there, he is going to be a defensive end. in some capacity.
I have it. I had it on my list, so
Okay,
I had better consider him one.
Because that's what's on my list. It is figure out what CJ Hicks is or isn't, and
Yes.
whoever else fits that description.
Yeah.
Because it can't just be the CJ Hicks role. He's not established enough as a player in the sport for it to just be a CJ Hicks role. This has to be a fundamental change in scheme and defensive front. And if it seems like Matt Patricia is going to come in here and do what maybe Jim Knowles has been trying to do for a couple of years and get more multiple, and we're not just going to see a 4 down front all the time, I get less worried about defensive end. Because we could see a world where it's Kenyatta Jackson, Edric Houston, Caden McDonald on the field. Kenyatta Jackson, Caden Curry, Caden McDonald on the field. Kenyatta Jackson, Caden McDonald, Edric, Jason Moore. Caden Curry, Edric Houston, Caden McDonald. You see them getting that? There could be a world where there's only one traditional defensive end on the field, or there's only one traditional defensive tackle on the field. And there are 3 down front, and it's a 3-3-5 or maybe even a 3-4, and the other guy coming off the edge is CJ Hicks. And I'm wondering, when Epi gets here this summer, does he fit that description? Does a guy like Zion Grady, who's 6'4", 235, does he fit that description? That's me. I use CJ Hicks to have a bigger conversation about Ohio State's been a 4 down front for as long as I can remember. And I do think that the personnel, because you're right, I think they're deeper at defensive tackle in terms of options, in terms of people who might turn into something versus defensive end. And I'm wondering if the window is now open to change things up in a way that the definition for what depth at defensive end changes, because guys like CJ Hicks are also now playing.
Yeah, I guess it's a conversation that goes hand in hand with each other, right? Like the defensive end conversation, a lot of it predicates on CJ Hicks, and what they do with him is going to determine a lot of what you got at defensive end. So he's an interesting piece. It's maybe in the moment here, but is he maybe the most like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, is he the X factor to what this defense? I'm not going to say what it is, like how good it is, but that's Caleb Downs. Is he the X factor to maybe what this defense looks like?
Yes, and I like that. Doesn't mean he's going to be. Oh, if he's hits, he's an All-American. I mean, yeah, if he hits, he's an All-American. He's a 5-star recruit. But the concept of where he's at might tell us a little bit about what they're doing defensively in terms of base look. I do agree with that notion. And that's a lot to put on a 5-star recruit who's not played a lot of snaps, but that's where we're at, right? He clearly is a guy who should be getting after the passer. He clearly is a guy who should have a role that looks more like Abdul Carter's than it does Fred Warner's. But that just hasn't been what's necessary the last 3 years because of what they've had at defensive end. They don't have that now, to your point, Stefan. Okay, Andrew, I'm assuming that was number 1 on your list as well.
Yeah, CJ was number 1, and Stefan kind of mentioned it. My number 2 point was the depth at defensive end.
Yeah.
Basically, I mean, what I had written down was figure out number 3 and number 4 defensive ends. Like assuming you are, going to stick with that, I think, all right, is that George? Is that the transfer? Does Mickens fit into that? Does Grady fit into that? Like you need to figure out where you're at. But at the risk of, or so I don't repeat myself and repeat ourselves. The next thing I want to do, or the next thing I want to bring up that was number 3 on my list is you got to find out which one of Caden Curry or Kenyatta Jackson can be a high level pass rusher. Cause I think you need one of them. And, we heard a lot of Kenyatta Jackson at the combine. A couple of guys were asked, hey, who do you think is the best pass rusher? Or, who do you think could take that next step? And a couple of guys said Kenyatta Jackson. I think that's a really big part of the spring for Ohio State because these are guys that have not had a ton of opportunity, right? You have not seen Kenyatta Jackson or Caden Curry with, hey, this starting job is yours now. Because JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer exist and they decided to play 4 years at Ohio State. So you haven't really seen them kind of given this, hey, the defensive end room is yours. The starting job is yours. You haven't seen them given that responsibility yet and responsibility and, reward, I guess. So I think you need to find one of these guys that can go do what similar things to what Jack and JT did, because JT had 12 and a half sacks, Jack had 9. You had 21 and a half sacks through 16 games through your defensive ends. I think Ohio State should really, really try to, make sure that they can get one of these guys at least that can be a high level pass rusher, because, if you're starting to talk about, Kenyatta Jackson, he's, a 3 sack guy, and Caden Curry's a 3.5 sack guy. I would worry about the pass rush in that scenario. And I think that if you can develop one of these guys into a true number one, okay, this guy is going to be, a first or second round pick in the 2026 NFL draft, I think that is really, really going to help this defense, especially considering what you just lost.
I want to say one thing on Kenyatta. I'm starting to get really high on Kenyatta, and maybe it's just, off season, you kind of start to talk yourselves into certain guys. I think Kenyatta is one guy that I'm really starting to circle and think that this dude could be a 10-plus sack type guy. And I was curious what the numbers look like in terms of snap counts for like Jack when he went from, being a reserve or number 2 option to when he went to being a starter. And it's just interesting because it's all just delayed a year, right? Like Kenyatta's he's having to do it 1 year later than Jack had to do it. But Kenyatta this past season played 316 defensive snaps, and Jack Sawyer in 2022 had 329 defensive snaps. So like the trajectory, the snap counts, all that, like we just saw Jack make that jump. So it goes back to your first question, the panic question. Like the reason not to panic is because this is kind of how it goes, right? Like you lose your stars, the next guy steps in after playing, 300 something snaps, he's ready to go. It's just happening a year later. So I think the progress has to come quicker. And I think that's why a guy like Kenyatta this spring is someone to watch, because it's got to happen now. Like for Jack, there was always, he decided to come back for 2024. So he had another year to get, the best version of Jack Sawyer was what we saw in the playoff, right? So he had time to get there. He had experience to get there. Kenyatta's kind of got to do it now. And I think it starts this spring. So I like that, Andrew. I think Kenyatta's a guy I got circled because I'm ready to see that. Does that jump start happening, pretty quick here?
Well,
yeah,
only play
who's the guy at the edge that other teams have to game plan for? Who's the guy at the edge that other teams are afraid of? That's kind of what I'm getting at.
Kenyatta only played 3 games his freshman year, so technically he's got a 5th year if he wants to come back. Caden Curry does not have a 5th year. He played 13 games. Kenyatta Jackson in 3 seasons, 25 tackles, 6 TFLs, 3 sacks, and he also has 29 pressures. Caden Curry in 3 years, 45 tackles, 10 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks, and he has 27 pressures. Why does it have to come from defensive end? And that's not a CJ Hicks thing. Maybe it is. Maybe CJ does get unleashed and he's that guy. But I'm less concerned about them finding a pass rusher at defensive end if they're going to change the scheme, because that also changes job descriptions. It doesn't mean that, Kenyatta Jackson, who had 1.5 sacks this year, and Caden Curry had 2.5 sacks. No, those numbers need to go up. Well, they probably will go up. They're going to play a lot more snaps this year. And I don't want to get too in depth with this because I'm going to bring it up tomorrow a lot. I am wondering if Ohio State's best weapons in terms of getting up to the quarterback are no longer going to always be defensive ends and defensive tackles. And if we are now looking at a world where these linebackers are getting after it, and Cody Simon had 7 sacks this year, Sonny Styles had 6. They were 3rd and 4th as your Mike and Will linebacker in sacks this year. So, and CJ Hicks, he only had 2, but that was 8th on the team. I'm just open to a world where if you're only going to have 3 out there potentially, and this is not concrete yet, but if they're only going to have 3 defensive linemen out there consistently and just be rotating a bunch of guys at those 3 spots, then to go, hey, Kenyatta, there's 1 less of you out here, but also get more sacks. I don't know if that's the right way to look at it. I do think they need to be able to do it, though. I do agree with that notion, because that was the thing about the playoff is it was all 4 guys who were harassing the quarterback. So whatever that looks like, fine. But I think, again, they've played 4 down front for as long as I can remember. So all the pressure was on how come the defensive line's not getting sacks, but they're getting pressure. I think that just might apply to the position directly behind them a little bit more going forward than it maybe has in quite a long time. My second one, and maybe this is in line with you guys, it's can Larry Johnson leave the spring feeling comfortable with 6? 3 guys on the outside, 3 guys on the inside. I don't think it's a realistic thing to go, hey, do you have 6 defensive ends and 6 defensive tackles who are ready to play football? No, these guys have barely played football. You think they're going to be ready because of 15 practice? No, but if the guys who have played football, if Kenyatta Jackson and Caden Curry on the outside, and then one more guy between Mickens, Kirks, potentially Hicks, and then if Edric Houston and Caden McDonald take the step that most think they're going to take, and then Tywan Malone, who's entering year 5 and has been a full-time football player now for 3 years, and Jason Moore, who looks the part but hasn't necessarily been the part, if you can get 3 in and 3 out, I think that's a successful spring for Ohio State, and it's something to build off of going into fall camp where then we can start having conversations about, okay, who's going to play what amount of snaps.
Give me your 6 right now then. Who are the 6 you predict will be, all right, we're feeling good about these guys?
Which can lead into the next thing. Edric Houston, Caden McDonald, I'm pretty sure about.
Yep.
On the interior. I don't have a lot of questions about them. Kenyatta Jackson, Caden Curry on the outside. Those are your starters. So essentially I'm asking for a reserve. I'll say, I mean, we're here. If we're going to do it, let's just go full throttle with it. CJ Hicks is the 3rd defensive end, or whatever that is. He's the 3rd dude coming off the edge. And I'm not saying this one is like a drive the bus situation at this point, but I am saying it more because, you know, Urban Meyer used to say all the time, the first 2 years are on us, and then everything after that is on you. I just think at some point, Jason Moore's got to turn 6'6", 305 pounds into something. And maybe he spent the first 2 years of his career learning what that something was physically. 7 snaps as a true freshman. He played 58 snaps this past year. But they kind of need him to be something special. They need him to do what Mike Hall did in 2022, where he wasn't on your radar, and then all of a sudden the Notre Dame game happens. You're like, oh, okay, that's different. Now, Mike Hall couldn't always sustain it because of health and whatnot, but he did so well in a small sample size that the Browns took him with the second pick with their second round pick in the NFL draft. So it was something. It meant something. I'm not saying Jason Moore has to pop out and be a second round draft pick after the 2025 season. In fact, I think Ohio State would rather him not do that. They would rather him really be very, very good and then come back in 2026 and be very, very good again. But I've just reached a point with him where it's like, you see him in fall camp, you see him get off the bus, and you're like, wow, that dude looks like he's an All-American. And then it just hasn't happened yet. And that's the prime example of you have to turn into something. And Hero Canu's departure makes it that much more important that he does. So if they can get those 6, CJ is just ready to go get after the quarterback because he's been waiting to do it for 4 years. And Jason Moore is ready to go now that he's in year 3. I think that's a quality spring.
Yeah, I would probably agree. I think maybe the nut graph of what we're talking about here about our defensive line conversation is that CJ Hicks is probably the guy we're like number 5 in terms of who you're most confident in. And that can be either very scary if you're listening to this, or it can be very exciting if you're listening to this.
Yeah. And it's like, I can't believe he's still living on the extremes 4 years into his career here. It's just, he might be Michael Parsons. He might not ever turn into anything. Here,
I would love to, join our text 614-350-3315. I'd love to hear what you guys think about CJ Hicks in 2025. Are you surprised that he's here? Did you think that he was going to transfer after the season? Are you excited about what he can be? Are you nervous about, him maybe being the top option outside of those, starting 4 or top 4, however we want to label them? Like, how do you feel about CJ Hicks in 2025?
I think I would like to add something to what Stefan just said. And yes, I think all of those things that he's asking our texters are valid. I'm also just curious, like, how many people are just like, I don't believe it anymore. Like, they're sick of hearing about CJ Hicks, and they're like, man, I've heard this. Y'all have told me for 2 years, Stephen and Andrew, that CJ Hicks is going to be a dog.
It's Jelani Thurman defense conversation.
Correct.
Yeah, it's like, it's like, all right, man, like this is either going to happen or it's not. And I wonder, let us know that too. Because, I'm sure there are a lot of texters who heard us talk about CJ Hicks in that last segment and went, oh,
Yeah, but
not
it's
again.
not. We didn't just go, hey, CJ Hicks. No, Jim Knowles said he was going to unleash CJ Hicks and then refused to unleash CJ Hicks.
It's not just something that we're creating. It's not something that we're manufacturing necessarily.
So, James Laurinaitis is the one who called him the best blitzer in the room. And then in the small sample size we saw him on the edge, yeah, he was the best blitzer in the room. So it literally is now or never. He's in year 4. Let's buy some stock. And I'm going to let Andrew go first. None of you are going to take my guy, so I'm not worried about it. So I'll let you guys have the guys at the top.
Oh, man.
But this is not driving a bus because a bus has to have something tangible. There's 15 practices of watching guys not be in pads for 2 days, be in more pads in 2 days after that, and then be in more pads but not really tackle each other. And it gets to a game that we're not even sure is fully a game yet. But buy some stock in somebody on the defensive line this spring, Andrew.
I was really hoping I wasn't going to go first because I really wanted to buy a penny stock. But
you can still do that.
No.
You can do whatever you want.
I think there's a better answer, and I think it's Edric Houston.
Okay.
For me, because I think Edric Houston, when you talk about him, there's a lot of people who might be going, well, he's already going to be a starter probably. He's already a 5-star recruit. Like, he's already got a lot of the athletic profile and the background that you would want. But Jack Sawyer the other day at the Combine said that he thinks he could be the best at his position in the sport. I thought that was interesting because, when you ask, hey, Jordan Hancock, who's going to step up in the secondary? They're going to be fine. I know those boys are going to take care of business. It's blah, 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 blah. And they list a couple of guys. Pretty much everybody does that, right? Denzel Burke, Emeka Egbuka, everybody kind of gives their, hey, this guy's going to be really good. Nobody's going to say, oh, my teammates are going to be bad. God forbid they were trying to replace me.
Denzel Burke would tell us if somebody was going to be bad.
On the record, I don't know if they're going to sit there and tell him.
We asked him about Will Howard in the spring last year. He's like, yeah, I don't see it. I don't see it at all.
Who said that?
Denzel Burke.
Oh, Denzel Burke, yeah. But you get what I'm saying. They're not going to say that the guys at their own position, I think, are going to be bad. I'll put it like that.
He said that about Aaron Scott.
I think that was kind of a freshman, let's get him going type of thing. I don't think he actually thinks Aaron Scott's bad. But I think that when you go through what people have said about Edric and what we saw from Edric and maybe what we think Edric can be, I'm buying in on Edric now because I think it's a little bit higher than other people in this room, but I don't really care because I think this could hit the moon, right? I think this could hit, hey, this guy's a 1st-round defensive tackle in 2 years and 3 years. And I think that in 2025, he might have a really, really good season. He might be that dominant 3-tech that I think a lot of people think he can be. So I'm getting in early on Edric Houston. I understand that it's kind of taken off a little bit already. The hype train has, but I don't care. I want to jump on it before it goes crazy.
I'm just gonna. It's not riding the bus or driving the bus.
Yeah,
it's buying stock. When you buy stock, you buy low, right?
Yeah,
you buy stock when it's cheap. I'm going with Zion Grady.
No, you can't go first anymore. You can't go first.
I went second. I didn't even go first.
Yeah, you can't go second anymore. Zion Grady, go ahead.
While Andrew was talking, let's see if I still have it open. I have it closed down. I was on YouTube watching some Zion Grady highlights.
I'm in.
And that dude is fast and big. And he's all over the field when you watch his highlights. And I understand, that's high school ball and the Big Ten is the Big Ten, but if Patricia goes this CJ Hicks route, well, let me say this first. I think Zion Grady could be good in a 4-2-5 where he's lining up at defensive end. I don't think he's as reliant on this defense looking different. But if they do decide to go this CJ Hicks route and kind of move CJ around a bit, I think that's something that you could do with Zion as well, and he could maybe be kind of the next up. But I think we're going to see a lot of him in his true freshman season. I think it's important that he's on campus now because I think he's got a chance with the entire conversation that we just had about the defensive line, specifically defensive end / edge. Like, that's a guy that's going to get playing time as a true freshman. I would be shocked if we're going into year 2 saying, well, he redshirted his freshman year. He only played 3 or 4 games. Like, I don't think that's going to be the case. The dude is, well, what are his measurables? Like 6'4", 235. Like, the dude's going to be all over the field. He's an athletic freak when you watch some of his highlights, and you look at his recruiting profile. I mean, he's a 4-star in the composite rankings. Okay, sure. I wonder if him being an Alabama native, if he had committed to Nick Saban's Alabama, if he would have gotten that. You know, when you mysteriously open it after they commit to Alabama, it's like, wait, he's a 5-star now?
I'm glad everybody notices they do that.
Yeah.
With Alabama.
Well, I noticed the contrary, where when I covered Mississippi State, a dude would be a 4-star because Alabama would be recruiting him. He would commit to Mississippi State, and he'd be a 3-star. You're like, what happened between February and March? We didn't play a single football game. He just happened to commit somewhere.
Politics happened.
But I think Zion Grady in some worlds would maybe be a 5-star. If you were to say which freshman on the defense, like you point to Devin Sanchez, it's a tough room for Devin Sanchez to get a ton of playing time. Zion Grady, I think, has a room where he can get a ton of playing time. I think going into 2026, maybe he's a starter as a sophomore.
You want to know what my favorite thing about the Edge of Houston season was? The way he just kind of said, excuse me, I'm just going to cut you in line real quick. Excuse me. Let me just go here. Oh, Purdue game. Excuse me. I'm just going to start. I'm going to start this game for you. Excuse me, Hero. Excuse me, Caden. Excuse me, Jason. All right. I like the front. Give me those 27 snaps, baby. I need them all.
Well, and ironically enough, his coach is named Larry. And if you watched Impractical Jokers, the best way to skip the line is you go, Larry.
Yep.
Larry.
Yeah. Larry's like, come on. He said, no,
that was an incredible reference, Stefan. Oh, my goodness. That's incredible.
The first 6 games, Larry's like, no, just stay back there and chill. Just relax. You'll get there. Purdue game, Ryan Day came over and said, hey, go get that kid from Georgia. Come on up here. Oh, excuse me. All right. 27 snaps. And then he was a normal part of the rotation. The only game he wasn't after the Purdue game, 27 snaps, played 16 against Northwestern, 10 against Indiana, only 2 against Michigan. And that's because Michigan ran the ball so much. And so you kept Tyleek and Ty out there as much as possible because, again, Execution's new to playing defensive tackle, so he's probably not ready for all that yet. Tennessee, 16 snaps, 14 against Oregon, 14 against Texas, and 11 against Notre Dame. He became a normal rotational piece, which is why we're talking about him the way we're talking about him right now. Because he essentially spent the first half of the year learning what the heck he was doing, and then went the second half of the year. Excuse me. Just gonna take a spot right here. This looks like where I should be as a 5-star. Zion Grady, I'm looking at his scouting report from 247 Sports, the national recruiting analyst. First of all, he said he projects that as a starter in a 3-4 outside linebacker role. Okay, cool. So that's more people who can do what CJ Hicks we think he might do this year. All right, cool. Check that off. A quick twitch mover. The Alabama native relies heavily on his first step in body quickness. His first step in foot and body quickness to gain leverage on opposing offensive linemen, while flashing the speed to power ability to illustrate his physical pass rushing potential at the next level. Okay, cool. That sounds good to me. Let's see here. 6'4", 225 pounds, verified. This was 2 years ago, by the way. This is evaluation October 27, 2023. 6'4", 225. He also has arm length of 34 inches plus. Okay, that checks off to me. I like all those things. You're saying good things to me. 247. I'm in for him going, excuse me, Josh Mickens. Excuse me, Dominic. Excuse me, CJ Hicks. You're going to share this role with me. And it might not be the first couple of weeks. I actually am not expecting him to play a single snap against Texas. At all. I think Ohio State is going to lean old. We can trust you right now as much as possible on August 30th because you have to. And I expect Texas to do the same thing. That's the logical choice. Get through the top 7 matchup, come up for air, and then figure it out later. Because that's what happened with Edge of Houston. They just didn't play anybody in the preseason. But they played Oregon, and it's the only game Edge of Houston didn't play in the entire year. The only game he didn't play in was the Oregon game. Grambling State, Ohio, I expect at least 10 snaps from Zion Grady. Then you got a bye week. Washington, Minnesota, Illinois. Let's get you up to 12. Let's get you up to 12 snaps a game. And then coming out for that Penn State game, Edric Houston actually, he played 6 snaps against Penn State. I think that Penn State game is the last time Zion Grady plays less than 11 snaps in a game. He's fully healthy for the rest of his career here. Because I see a similar trajectory of how 5 stars go here. You spend the first half of the season figuring it out, and then the second half of the season excuse me, I'm just going to take a spot right here. I'm going to take a spot right here with the 2s. Because next year it's going to be with the 1s. And you're right. I think if he was not at Ohio State, he's one of the best programs in the country. He'd be a 5-star recruit, which is a nuts thing to say.
Yeah.
But I think he's a bit underrated, and I think there is a monster in that player right there, and I can't wait to see him in Pats.
I want to offer one rebuttal to what you say. I think you're right that maybe we don't see him a ton against Penn State. I like the idea of him playing a good bit against Penn State, just so James Franklin can look over at his defensive coordinator and be like, "You didn't tell me about that guy."
Yes. Yeah. I'm in. I'm all in on Zion Grady. I'm all in. So, I mean, just for the sake of bringing somebody else into this conversation, I'll buy some stock in Jason Moore because I think it is as low as it's been. Because he's just been so back of the line. And he still looks the part. So what if it does pop in year 3? I'm open to the idea. I just also know that it needs to pop in year 3. It's a situation of you can be excited about its potential, but also hammering the table home that like you kind of need to go. It's time to go, Jason Moore. But really, it's because I wasn't able to say Zion Grady, and I'm in. You sold me. You didn't even try to sell me, Larry. I'm just in on Zion Grady, and I can't wait to see him in pads, and I can't wait to ask you about him so you can go, well, he's learning, learning the Rushman. He's drinking the Kool-Aid, all those different things. Okay, that's some stock buying stuff. Good pod, guys. Let's take our final break, and then we'll wrap this up with one simple question as a way to wrap up defensive line talk as we continue to preview spring practice here on Buckeye Talk.
Hi, here's your report.
Thanks, Jane. I wish I could hire a whole team of yous.
Try posting a job on LinkedIn. It's the world's largest professional network. Unlike resumes, LinkedIn gives a real-time view into a candidate's skills, experiences, and more.
Huh, let's do it. You're irreplaceable, Jane, but another you would be great.
Find your perfect match with LinkedIn. Post your free job at linkedin.com/achieve. That's linkedin.com/achieve. Terms and conditions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
And we're back here on Buckeye Talk. Stephen Means, Stefan, Krajisnik, and Andrew Gillis. We're previewing spring practice for Ohio State. 15 practices, 14 actual practices, and the 15th practice is the spring showcase, in which the details are still yet to be revealed and what that entitles on April 12th. In the meantime, we'll be previewing all these positions. I asked our texters about every single position group, and I asked them to rank them as well. 614-350-3315, 2-week feature out, $399 after that. Don't tell me where you have the other defensive groups, because we got 4 other pods to get through this week. Andrew, I want you to tell me where you have the defensive line. 1 through 4, the 4 defensive groups on defense. That was a weird way to say that. Where is the defensive line for you right now, heading into spring?
Heading into spring? That was a hard one. I had them 3rd.
Okay.
Yeah, 3rd.
Okay. Stefan, where do you have them?
I have them 4th.
Yeah. Our Texans had them 4th too, and it was a pretty significant gap. They got 59.3% of the 4th place votes, 19.2% of 3rd place votes, 13.2% of the 2nd place votes, and 8.2% of the 1st place votes. It is like very clear they are 4th. And it's because they lost everybody. As I said, they lost If you add in Hero Canoe, which I just did, 221 tackles, 45 TFLs, 27.5 sacks, and 157 pressures. That's a lot of production to lose and to still have. It's not that you don't have faith. It's just when you're comparing them to the other groups, it's maybe not that high. So here's my question, and I also want to add context to it. Ohio State's 2025 defensive line will be, in comparison to the 2024 group, worse, the same, or better? Stefan, are you worse, the same, or better?
I'm going with the worst, or not the worst. Please don't panic. I'm sorry. Worse. I'm going with worse because it's the conversation we had last week. It is unfair for us to sit at the NFL Combine exhausted after talking to 4 starters on the defensive line that are at the NFL Combine and expect 2025, no matter how good it is, to expect it to be the same or better, I think would be unfair. So I go worse, and I say worse because I want to compliment once again the 2024 defensive line and how good those 4 starters were.
Andrew, I'm assuming you're worse too, but does worse have to be a bad thing?
No, and that's exactly where I was going to go. Like, Ohio State, first in scoring defense last year, 12.9 points per game. Second in rushing defense, 2.65 yards per play. Total defense, first, 4.19 yards. Sacks per game, third, 3.31. You can still be like a top 12 defense and that's technically worse. That's technically worse. You could run a 4.2 flat 40, run a 4.2 640 on your second attempt, and it's technically worse. So yeah, I look at this defense and it's like, it doesn't mean you're bad. Like, worse does not mean worst. Like, that's kind of where we're at with this unit. And, you know, again, you have a first round pick in Tyleik Williams. You have, I mean, let's be real. What's the worst case scenario, I think, for these two, or for these 4 defensive linemen? Tyleik late first. JT and Jack maybe go like second and third. One of them goes second, one of them goes early third, something like that. Ty Hamilton's a 5th or a 6th round pick. That's still really good. Are you replacing that? I don't think so right away. I mean, we're talking about a defense that had 8 players that are headed to the NFL on it, and in its entire starting defensive line, I don't think it's unfair to say this unit is not going to be as good. And I also think that's the rational, objective perspective. I also think it's the rational, objective perspective to say, you know what, they still got a lot of talent and they can still be pretty good. You know, we're not saying, you know, that this defense is going to fall off and teams are going to run for 4 yards a carry against them and they're going to be one of the worst rush defenses in the country. And like, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is you lost 4 NFL players, dudes who could have been in the league this past NFL season, the 2024 season. And they're not going to be as good, but they still might be really good.
What if they end up being just as good?
Look, if they end up being just as good, I mean, I don't know what you do at that point, because multiple people in that Ohio State football program deserve immense amounts of raises. Larry Johnson, the strength and conditioning team, pretty much everybody, because I mean, you would be taking guys that are headed to the NFL and one of the best defensive lines in terms of most talent in Ohio State history, and then being like, all right, we're just going to keep doing this every year.
I mean, that's kind of, yeah. That's not that outlandish of a thing to say. Like, it happens here where a guy leaves and someone's better. Joey Bosa was awesome. And then you had Nick Bosa. And then you had Chase Young. And you know what? We can even go a step down from that. Tyquan Lewis was the Big Ten Defensive Lineman of the Year, just like Chase Young and Joey Bosa was. Is he as talented as those two were? No. But he was productive. I mean, we're watching it with the wide receivers right now. They just don't stop. They continue to keep churning out wide receivers. We're saying it's going to happen with the corner. This is how it works at Ohio State and at Alabama under Nick Saban and Georgia and Tech. This is what Blue Bloods do. You lose NFL players and you replace them with NFL players. So I'm not going to... Yes, they're probably going to be worse. Individually as players, I don't know if Kenyatta Jackson, Caden Curry, Edric Houston, and Caden McDonald the versions of them right now heading into spring are better than the versions who just walked out the door. That is probably true. It does not mean that we don't get to the middle of the season and go, man, I can't believe Kenyatta Jackson didn't play more last year. I can't believe Edgercution didn't play. That's how it works here. So, yeah, you lost NFL talent, boo-hoo. This is what you do. This is why you recruit at the high level every single year. But 71% of our texters said worse. 26% said same. 3% said better. I don't think they'll be better. But I do think that if we do this same exercise in May after we've seen things, depending on how this goes this spring, 71% worse and 26% same might be 66% worse, 31% the same. And that's progress. Because, I mean, statistically speaking, the 2023 defense was better than the 2024 defense. And it was the same exact people. So it's just, I'm not going to rule out the same as much as I think right now we're ruling it out, simply because we just left the NFL Combine and we haven't seen a lot of those guys. But it's a fair thing to bring up. Okay. So right now we think it's the fourth best group. Well, three of the four of us think it's the fourth best group. And Andrew thinks it's the third best group. I'm very interested to see who he has as the fourth best group. But I do think we could get to a world where just because you're the fourth best group doesn't mean you're a bad group. Right? Somebody has to be the fourth best group. Last year, I think the linebackers were the fourth best group. Well, actually, no, the cornerbacks were the fourth best group. But they were still fine. They just had some bad games. But that's our defensive line. Spring practice starts in 2 weeks. We'll continue this throughout the next 2 weeks. Tomorrow is linebackers, and then we'll do cornerbacks and safeties to wrap up this week. And then next week, we'll do the offensive side of the ball. Both sides, new coordinators, some new coaches on the offensive side. No new position coaches on the defensive side. 4 same assistants, just a new leader in Matt Patricia leading that group. Get the text 614-350-3315, 2-week free trial, $3.99 after that for Stefan Krajisnik and Andrew Gillis. I'm Stephen Means, and that was Buckeye Talk.